The year is 1989, New York City, Manhattan, and one cold November 30th evening, Linda was sleeping in her 12th story apartment, and before she knew it, Linda was being abducted by aliens.
Joining us now is Linda. She says she's been abducted by extraterrestrials not once but several times in her life. She's in silhouette today because she fears her family will be in danger if she reveals her identity. Now, her story, guys, is a little bit different because her abduction happened right here in New York City in front of many witnesses. Linda, tell us what happened.
Linda found herself at the heart of what many consider the most compelling and controversial alien abduction case, known as the Manhattan Transfer Abduction. Initially known as Linda Cortile, she later changed her name to Linda Napolitano. On the night of November 30th, 1989, shortly past 3 a.m., Linda Napolitano was on the cusp of sleep when she experienced an unusual numbness in her feet, gradually spreading upward.
Well, apparently, one evening when I went to bed and I was in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, you know, a lot of us say our prayers before we go to sleep, I felt a presence in the room, and I felt numbness start creeping up from my toes up. And I closed my eyes because I was very frightened, and then I realized if I was going to protect my family and me, I'd have to open up my eyes.
Upon opening her eyes, she was met with the sight of an oddly pale humanoid entity with a large round head and big black eyes standing at the foot of her bed. From behind the curtains, another creature emerged, followed by another 4 or 5 beings that silently and slowly approached her bed. Napolitano cried out for her husband, sleeping peacefully beside her, but to no avail. The numbness reached her neck and immobilized her. She attempted to scream again, only to hear a voice in her mind commanding her to be silent.
By now, my knees are numb. And then it got on top of the bed, and it crouched down, looked me straight in the eyes, and hissed. They hissed.
Next, she felt herself levitating above the bed, floating from the bedroom into the living room, with the creatures silently accompanying her. She floated through a window and the safety bars outside, hovering outside her 12-story apartment, surrounded by a bright blue light. She and the other creatures gradually ascended into a saucer-shaped craft. Once inside, they guided Linda down a hallway furnished with benches. As they passed various rooms, the hiss of doors sliding open and closing was heard. Creatures conversed amongst themselves in an unintelligible language. Eventually, they guided Linda into a brightly lit room with a long table at its center. This triggered a panic in Linda, and she began to shout in her mind, her words translating into an alien language. One of the beings put a hand over Linda's mouth, then proceeded to insert a long medical instrument into her right nostril. One of the entities moved closer to Linda, gently running its hand through her hair and placing a comforting hand on her cheek. When she inquired about her purpose there, the creature simply replied, just for a visit. Suddenly, Linda found herself able to move. She sat up, heard a loud roar, and found herself sitting up in her bed. She tried to rouse her husband, Steve, but he remained motionless. She rushed down the hallway into her 2 young sons' room, but they also failed to respond. She attempted to wake her youngest, Johnny, but he too was unresponsive. Bud Hopkins. Over his lifetime, he was recognized as one of the leading UFO investigators globally. In the 80s, Bud had began a series of books on the subject of alien encounter. His first being 1981's Missing Time, Bud Hopkins authored 2 books on the topic, by his second book, Intruders, The Incredible Visitations of Copley Woods. As she read, she started connecting the dots. 13 years earlier, she had found a bump near her nose, which a doctor dismissed as a surgical scar, despite no surgery having been performed. And now here's where things get really strange. The 2 security officers, known only as Richard and Dan II, apparent witnesses to Linda's abduction. Hopkins says he never met them, doesn't know their last names, and knows their story only through letters and audio tapes they sent. became obsessed with quartile. Officers Dan and Richard sent a letter expressing their concerns. They stated that the oval had never reappeared from beneath the river. Their guilt had lingered, making life difficult. They questioned whether they should attempt to find her. They knew the building and the window. Maybe she was merely a figment of their imagination. If not, was she still alive and well? They needed to know if they decided to seek this person, they'd contact Hopkins with more information if they found her. Bud Hopkins was taken aback. He recognized the woman mentioned in the letter. She had been attending his support groups. It was Linda Napolitano. This was the first time Hopkins had multiple accounts of the same event. Approximately 2 weeks later, Linda called, clearly agitated. She had just been visited by 2 police detectives named Richard and Dan. It was a peculiar visit. Close to 11 in the evening, Linda heard a knock at her door. Through the peephole, she saw 2 men in dark suits, identifying themselves as detectives. She let them in. Richard and Dan, the men who penned the letter to Bud Hopkins, were now in her living room, according to Linda. Dan was somewhat aloof and distant, whereas Richard was kind, albeit nervous. At one point during their 30-minute conversation, Richard appeared close to tears. Linda recounted her experience, including how her husband and children were put into such a deep sleep that she couldn't rouse them for several hours. Linda requested that Richard and Dan contact Bud Hopkins, but they declined, uncomfortable with the idea. After their departure, Linda thought it was over until Hopkins received another letter. The letter, accompanied by an audio tape, was from Dan and Richard. The recording was of Richard alone, recounting the events of the night Linda was taken.
My father was very disoriented and embarrassed. This is what he said to me.
He expressed hope that the recording would be useful to Bud, despite his unwillingness to publicly confirm the story. He described his memory of Linda's expressionless, pale face, and the 3 creatures escorting her into the craft. Richard and Dan were grappling with what they had witnessed. Richard was coping, but Dan's sanity was wavering. A few weeks after Hopkins received the audio tape from Richard, Dan sent him a letter. He expressed anger, fear, and embarrassment. He was dealing with these feelings by secretly watching Linda, something he didn't think she would appreciate. But for him, seeing Linda reinforced the reality of the situation, easing his feelings of insanity. This approach didn't work for Dan. Seeing Linda was a painful reminder of the incident. Linda, for her part, noted a white van parked near her building and felt as though she was being followed and watched. The November incident remained the most distressing event. A young woman being abducted was a scenario that overwhelmed them. Their minds are filled with questions about what would happen to her and how they could help. Sleep was no refuge, with nightmares haunting both of them. They both kept their pistols close when sleeping, fearful that if Linda could be taken, so could they. They recognized that Hopkins needed them to step forward to defend the sanity of those claiming to have similar experiences. However, they believed that more than just 2 detectives would be necessary to solve these mysteries. They warned Hopkins to be cautious with any tangible evidence he might find, suspecting a cover-up. After expressing their gratitude for his time, the letter from Dan concluded. This was when Hopkins decided to locate Richard and Dan. He visited precincts across the city, posting flyers, but no officers came forward. The reason was that Richard and Dan weren't actually cops. Hopkins didn't share with Linda that Richard and Dan had deceived her about their professions. He wanted to see what else he could uncover first. A few weeks later, another letter arrived for Hopkins. This letter revealed that there was more to the story. They had been granted permission to reveal more details by a third party who was also involved in the November 1989 incident. This third party, a highly significant person who frequently addressed many corners of the globe, was eventually revealed as Javier Perez de Cuellar, the Secretary General of the United Nations. It turned out that Richard and Dan were providing security for the Secretary General, driving him to the downtown heliport. When they neared Linda's building, their car stopped working, and all 3 of them witnessed the event. De Cuellar insisted on remaining anonymous, leading Richard and Dan to impersonate cops. And while the Secretary General was relieved to hear about Linda's safety, he wanted nothing more to do with the event. Richard and Dan, on the other hand, continued to grapple with their emotions. A few weeks later, Linda ran into Richard on her way to the supermarket. Richard invited her for a ride in a nearby luxury car to have a talk. Linda declined, citing errands, but offered an invitation to her apartment later that evening. Richard insisted on the ride, but Linda refused again. Suddenly, Richard grabbed her, and with Dan's help, they forced her into the car. During the drive, Richard and Dan interrogated Linda, accusing her of working for the government or the aliens. Linda vehemently denied these accusations. When Linda wouldn't stop crying, Dan demanded she remove her shoes so he could examine her feet. Despite feeling absurd, Linda complied, knowing they would force her if she didn't. After almost 4 hours of questioning about the aliens and their actions, they finally dropped her off at her apartment building, which is known as the Knickerbocker Village just off Catherine Slip and Cherry. He apologized for their actions towards Linda, admitting that there was no excuse, but attributing it to the tremendous stress they were under. It was revealed that Richard, Dan, and Secretary General DeCooler had shared a memory that was triggered in the past few months. After the UFO disappeared into the river, they found themselves on a beach where they saw Linda and 3 extraterrestrials digging in the sand. They heard them conversing in an alien language. When Linda and the aliens approached them, Linda, with a blank expression, held up a dead fish and accused them, "Look and see what you've done." Then one of the aliens referred to her as the Lady of the Sands. In his letter, Dan expressed frustration, stating that they knew Linda was withholding information when they questioned her in April. Perhaps she was scared and unsure of their intentions. They were led to believe that she was the Lady of the Sands, but they still didn't know who she really was. Dan confessed his annoyance with Linda, stating that even if she flew to the moon in her spacecraft, the distance wouldn't be far enough for him. Despite this, he contemplated having a sincere conversation with Linda. Even though he knew she would not consent, he was determined to understand how she was different. He requested Bud to prepare Linda for a visit from him and insisted that they didn't kill the fish. Bud then hypnotized Linda again to see if she could recall these events. She remembered all of it. She revealed that they were taking sand samples to figure out why the fish were dying and remembered being called Lady of the Sands, but was unsure of its meaning. On October 15th, Dan, acting alone and seemingly out of his mind, grabbed Linda in broad daylight and forced her into his car. After driving for a while, he pulled over and whispered to Linda, calling her a half-breed, and kissed her all over her face, periodically grabbing her knee during the drive. He reached a beach house on Long Island where Dan instructed Linda to make herself comfortable while he made coffee. She searched for a phone or any identifying information, finding nothing but 2 framed pictures, one of Linda saying goodbye to her son Johnny, and the other of Linda by a lighthouse. Dan returned from the kitchen with a gift-wrapped box containing a necklace, which he instructed Linda to wear. She refused, but seeing the anger in his eyes, she offered to wear it over her clothes, to which he agreed. Suddenly, Dan went pale, fell to his knees, and started crying, exclaiming, "It was you, Lady of the Sands." Linda took advantage of the moment, escaping onto the beach. However, Dan caught up with her and attacked her. Luckily, Richard was there to the rescue and de-escalated the situation. A critique by investigators George Hansen, Richard Butler, and Joseph Stiefel puts the story under scrutiny. They interviewed Linda, conducted extensive research, and claimed to have debunked the narrative. The first hurdle to cross is that Linda is the only direct witness to Richard and Dan's actions. However, there are audio tapes sent to Bud and other individuals who have listened to these tapes. Janet Kimball, the woman whose car stalled on the Brooklyn Bridge, has been spoken to and seen conversing with Bud. However, a handwriting analysis of her letter indicates a match with Linda's handwriting. Linda also claimed her cousin Connie was present during an attempted kidnapping. When Bud requested to speak to Connie, he concluded that Linda had called pretending to be Connie. The story includes a meeting between Secretary General Decueller and Bud at O'Hare Airport, a meeting that was never witnessed by any other party. Decueller's representatives deny his involvement, stating he was asleep at home that night. His office also issued a statement denying the occurrence of such events. One of the aspects that make the story doubtful is Linda's failure to report the multiple kidnappings, assaults, and near-death experiences to the police. She cited fear for her safety and that of her family as the reason, even when Bud suggested she approach the police. In interviews with Linda and her husband, Steve was largely silent and had difficulty answering many questions. Linda would often interject to assist him in remembering. Steve left the interview early despite Linda's request for him to stay. The couple's marriage didn't last, although it's unclear whether this was related to the events. Linda's fascination with aliens and UFOs and her contact with Bud shortly after reading his book Intruders suggest her tale's potential inspiration from science fiction. A few months prior to Linda contacting Bud Hopkins, the sci-fi novel Night Eyes was released, which has notable similarities to Linda's account. Skeptics often point to the visibility of Linda's building from the New York Post's loading dock. At 3 a.m., the dock is bustling with workers loading trucks, yet no one reported seeing a UFO or anything unusual. However, the investigators only interviewed the manager, who spends the majority of his shift in an office, away from the loading dock that would have faced Linda's apartment complex. From the loading zone of Linda's building, it is impossible to see her residence. Bud Hopkins asserts that Linda's story remained consistent over a span of 10 years. However, this is disputed by individuals who have witnessed her speeches at conventions, noting alterations in the details over time. Initially, Linda stated that she would receive half of the income generated from book sales or a potential movie deal related to her story. She later retracted this claim, then admitted to lying purposefully. She further clarified that she did receive a percentage, albeit a nominal one. However, the reality is that Linda received between 15 and 25 of the profits from book sales, movie rights, or any other derivatives of her story. If Linda is indeed fabricating this saga, she has managed to involve numerous individuals. Bud Hopkins possesses multiple witness testimonials on both audio and video, which have been validated by others. Linda, however, has made rather outrageous claims, such as being abducted by aliens, along with mafia boss John Gotti, the Dapper Don. Other assertions include her being part alien, possessing immortal red blood cells, being a descendant of Joan of Arc, being a professional singer in a renowned pop band, having met Cardinal O'Connor, being invited to a private audience with the Pope, and being present in the World Trade Center when the 9/11 attacks occurred. Bud Hopkins was aware of these claims, but chose to omit them from his book, possibly to avoid antagonizing a notorious crime boss. Supporters of Bud Hopkins hail him as an exceptional investigator, yet others disagree, pointing out his preference for interviewing and hypnotizing individuals who reinforce his belief in alien abduction narratives. His investigations lacked objectivity, according to his own wife, Carol. Bud prioritized crafting the narrative rather than seeking the truth, reacting defensively and angrily when his story was questioned. However, Bud Hopkins was also known for his compassion, kindness, and empathy, hosting weekly UFO abduction support group meetings at his home. He was inclined to believe and help those who claimed to have been abducted by aliens, making him susceptible to manipulation. Speculation surrounds Linda's motives. Was she seeking attention or monetary gain? Her status transitioned from a housewife to a celebrity within the UFO community, a role she appeared to relish. Despite the bizarre nature of this story, its authenticity remains unconfirmed even after 30 years, with no individual stepping forward to reveal it as a hoax. The narrative hinges on Linda's testimony, creating a polarizing situation where one must either believe in the entirety of the events or dismiss them completely. The audience is presented with all available information and left to form their own conclusions. Regardless of whether one believes the story to be factual or a fabrication, proving either stance remains a challenge. Currently, Linda appears to be active on social media and is now in her 70s. Well, what do you think? Is Linda making the whole story up, or is this perhaps the greatest UFO secret? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching our channel.